welcome back to the show. Today we have author Peter Bebergal, who is the author of Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. Man, thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Great to see you and hear you, Alex.
Yeah, so what was your inspiration leading into this book?
I think it was largely that I had always had an attraction to, I guess you would say, fringe culture. I been recently working on a book actually about growing up as a fan of monster movies in the late 60s and into the 70s, and was always interested in the supernatural. But it was really I mean, this is sort of, I talk about this in the book, but it was really my brother's album collection and the way in which he would carefully collate like what I got to see and what I got to hear. Like his stereo was completely off limits to me. Like I could not go into his room and mess with his stereo. But
Hmm.
he would, play stuff for me. And he always seemed to play things for me that at least at a young age always felt like they had this mix of being both a little bit otherworldly, but also kind of sinister. Like there was just something that felt like almost dangerous about them.
Hmm.
So, he would play Alice Cooper for me. He would play the one that really he tormented me with, but I couldn't stop. He would invite me in to listen to music, and he would play Revolution 9 from the Beatles' White Album, which scared the shit out of me, but I couldn't not. I didn't run away either, so fascinated by it. And uh, another essential one was David Bowie's Diamond Dogs record. And there was also, even necessarily whether he played them for me or didn't play them for me, it was while he was playing music for me, looking at the album covers. And I remember feeling really creeped out by the present Led Zeppelin's Presence album cover with the weird, little icon, the black mini monolithic figurine that all the different people have. It was just something about that where there was a part of me that understood on some subliminal level, like what this was trying to evoke, but I didn't have words for it, trying to evoke just a kind of almost like a fantastical world in which this thing is worshipped and it represents something that we can never know.
Hmm.
So, that just brought me that was always sort of just part of my interests as a by the time I was a teenager, the only thing I cared about was punk rock. So there was very little of that kind of, I guess, occult resonances, in the music that I was listening to.
Hmm.
But it wasn't until much later when I was was studying religion in college and in grad school, and it just it was always there, this sort of interest in what I call in the book the occult imagination. And I thought it would be interesting to try to explore that, through the things that just I remember as a kid used to make me feel really, again, both so compelled by it and yet so frightened by it.
It's so interesting that you say that because I remember when I was really young, we used to go up to Maryland and spend summers with my great grandparents up in their attic. They had these it's like mirror type art from a lot of these bands, and it would be like Led Zeppelin and like
Oh,
Grateful
the
Dead.
mirrors, yes, the people
And
used to do their lines on those mirrors.
yeah, yeah. Oh God. But I remember having a very similar feeling to that. You couldn't explain it, you know? Who were
Yes.
some of the first bands that when you were starting to look into some of this information a little bit later on in life, who were some of the first bands you're like, "Oh wow, they were into that. And,
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was though was well, it was challenging because there's a broad spectrum of first of all what we even call the occult. It means so many different things
hmm
to so many different people.
true.
So, there's certain kinds of Western esoteric magical practices. There's like ceremonial magic and the stuff that came out of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and then later Thelemic and Crowley related traditions. So we have that. Then you
hmm
just have people who are working with tarot cards or other spirits related to maybe their own cultural backgrounds or so it's I part of what I was struggling with was realizing that just that was casting such a wide net. And then when I started to want to understand how musicians and bands were responding to this through sort of the decades, I also realized that a lot of that was often very, very different between, the bands or the musicians. So we know that Jimmy Page was a collector and devotee of Aleister Crowley. There's even some stories of him and Kenneth Anger at auctions bidding on the same Crowley books, which is actually how they ended up meeting, I believe.
Oh wow.
Page bought the what's called the Bullskin House, which is where Crowley performed what's called the Abramelin working, which is a had actually there was a fire some years ago, and they've just recently, I think, rebuilt it. In any case, his interest in that doesn't even actually play out that much in their actual music and their lyrics, right? So we it plays out in, I think, who he was as an artist and how he thought about the music that he was making. But there's more lyrics about Tolkien's Middle Earth than there is anything that you might say are a cult in the in that sense of the word.
Yeah.
And then you have somebody like David Bowie who was a deep reader, of this material, and I think incorporated it into both his lyrics and also just in his whole sort of self-alchemical work, if you would. So part of it was just also trying to understand all the different ways in which it expressed itself. Was it just an interest that somebody in the band had that sort of inspired them or was part of their own thinking about themselves as an artist? Was it something that just they thought would look cool on an album cover because it was sort of in the air at the time? Was it something that people got swept up in? Like, I think Mick Jagger became sort of friendly with Kenneth Anger and was sort of part of that scene for a little while, but he was pretty spooked by it, and he was in no way a practitioner, as far as I know, of anything like that. I'm sure he had his tarot cards read or whatever, so, but it's that broader cultural marker of the occult that we've attached to the music and to the aesthetics of rock and roll that was so fascinating to me. And what was it about rock and roll that one both triggered for parents and the media and kids that somehow a lot of this music was something that could transmit some secret occult knowledge. And in some ways, I think that what I learned, which I think became really important, is that the spirit of the occult and the spirit of rock and roll are very similar, whether or not there's anything really occult, about the music or the bands. And I think it just has to do with a spirit of, it's more than just a spirit of rebellion. It's a spirit of being heterodox, of being really pushing against the mainstream ideas of what art or what spirituality should be. And so that's, sort of taking your own spiritual path into your own hands as opposed to having it being delivered to you, say, by a priest, right? Which is in many ways a lot of what a magical practice is about, and is in many ways, I think, a lot about what just the kind of sensibility of rock and roll, at least in the early days, was. But it's not easy to answer, like I said, because as I started to investigate, I just saw there's so many different ways to think about, or how different bands, how different musicians were responding to what was obviously something that both they and the culture had attached in a really broad way
Hmm.
to rock and roll.
That's a very interesting point because you do go through all of that in the book. Like you said, there are differences in artists like Jimmy Page and David Bowie and like Ozzy Osbourne. Was Ozzy Osbourne like somebody that was maybe mischaracterized into that?
I think so. I mean, it's a good question. It's a funny thing about being mischaracterized. I think a lot of these guys, they talked about it on from both sides,
Yeah.
both sides of their mouth, So they,
Mhm.
if you look at if you watch some videos, or if your listeners ever been to an Ozzy Osbourne show, it's staged like some great dark magical ceremony. But there's interviews of him, we're talking to him backstage. He's like, "But this is just my show, man. I don't worship the devil, you know." I mean, there's a funny thing also even about Black Sabbath. Someone was commenting about how, they were one of the most heavily accused bands of being in league with Satan,
Mhm.
and they're actually the most like moralistic,
Yeah.
of the
You listen to like
bands.
War Pigs and like half of the
Yeah,
lyrics
yeah.
behind
Satan's
it.
a bad guy in that song.
Yeah, it's funny.
But they still wore that as, I think the glamour. And then that's, I mean, that's an interesting thing to talk about when we talk about what magic is. So, the idea that a magic spell, say a glamour that is intended to produce an illusion, or,
Hmm.
to change your shape in a way so that the person looking at you sees or experiences something different than what you are, so that you can properly seduce them or whatever it is you're trying to do, say in that sort of the lore about a spell like that.
Hmm.
I would say that in many ways a band like Black Sabbath and later Ozzy Osbourne really understood how to cast a glamour, right, on the culture to give this appearance of something that was dangerous, that was, hinted at the satanic, or however people understood that. And I think that, but there's a part of me that, while obviously can see that and is, say, but I'm not, it, if anything, I find that is something that enlivened it. It's part of why it can be so exciting even now to listen to some of this music, even though, you listen to Led Zeppelin, you listen to, well, we're talking about Black Sabbath rather, listening to Black Sabbath now, like their first album, and I was talking about sort of that sinister quality, especially, with the Devil's tritone, right, with
Hmm.
that as the edge of that sound. And I mean, I'm 58 years old, and I don't believe that these bands, that a band like Black Sabbath is satanic, but I can still feel the resonant quality of that even now, listening to that and understanding how, what we're talking about now, Jesus, 50 years ago, how powerful that would have been, or how
Yeah.
scary it would have been, so how powerful it would have been for a kid and how scary it would have been for their parents.
Were there any artists that you looked into that you were surprised at their involvement in some of this magic
Yeah,
or
that's a really,
manipulation?
yeah, that's a good question. I think it was mostly that discovering like the people that sort of found their way. And again, I think here's what I would say that's really important.
Hmm.
I think if you're an artist And we see this all the way back, even in the days of modern classical music with composers like Satie and Ravel, these early, what we call, sort of the modern classical, the artists that we refer to now as like the pre-Raphaelites or the symbolists or the decadent artists like Aubrey Beardsley. So artists, musicians who were, like we said earlier, were, sort of pushing against the boundaries of the mainstream, pushing against normative ideas of what art or music is supposed to sound like according to some, right, hierarchy of those systems. If that's what your art is doing, it only makes sense that if you are seeking something for your spiritual life, that you would also turn to things that are a little bit on the outside, a little bit, feeling, fringe is not always the best word, but even spiritually unorthodox, say. So somebody like Satie or Ravel they were involved in like Rosicrucian orders. We know like how many incredible artists and writers were involved in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It really attracted a lot of really important, obviously, the great Irish poet Yeats was a formative figure in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn at the turn of the century. So, that's always been a part of that, especially as we moved into the transition from the 1800s into the 1900s, when there was so much of this going on, partly because of a response to both the psychology and philosophy of Freud, and Darwin's understanding of evolution. There was a sense of people wanting to somehow get back to some more irrational and romantic sense of things so that we didn't kind of lose our souls in the face of these things that felt, even though they may be true, still felt soulless.
Mhm.
So if you think about artists like Page or like David Bowie, but then I found out like Daryl Hall of Hall and Oates
Oh, damn. Yeah.
did an album that was sort of his dedication to Crowley, like of all like the most like pop, artists, So it was interesting again just to see the ways in which it had less to do even with the maybe the culture of rock and roll as it had to do with what it meant and what it means to be an artist who is wanting to experiment with sound and with form and then with their own spiritual life, right? It just kind of feels natural that that's how things would go. And then you have, where it gets really intense, where the practice and the art, the magical interest and the art become completely intertwined, say as in the case of some of the British some of the bands that came out of like British industrial, like Psychic TV and then Coil. I don't know if you're familiar with bands like Genesis Peorage was originally part of Throbbing Gristle, and then a band called Psychic TV, and then you have some of those people also from Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV formed a band called Coil, which is very much it's almost impossible to separate the music from the magical practice that they themselves believe that they were performing. So there's so many different shapes of that. But yeah, so going back to your question, just to see like somebody like Daryl Hall, I found interesting conversations with Robert Fripp about his interest in the sort of some ideas that arose out of a teacher named Gurdjieff, and him becoming involved in a sort of splinter of that, and that becoming very important to him. And so yeah, so there are those that are you'd be surprised, but then you're not surprised because a lot of people are interested in these things. And it only makes sense, like I said, that if you're somebody whose art already is something that you're really trying to explore in a new way, that you might reach for a spiritual practice or even just, reading a book about, how many rock and roll musicians do you imagine in the 1970s had a copy of the Satanic Bible? And I would say 80% of them probably never even opened it, right?
Damn, yeah.
But it was like you're just supposed to have it around.
Yeah. Have it on the shelf.
Exactly.
So, speaking about some of those behind the scenes teachers, and I guess some of them not so behind the scene, like Aleister Crowley, how involved was he in this movement? Because you do see him on album covers like the Beatles, and you hear people singing about him and all of that. How
Yeah.
connected was he with some of these
Well, I think
artists?
he's going to be because in many ways he is, much of what we, it's not all of it, I think. And I was just reading some sort of a forum debate about what impact he may actually have had or not, but certainly a large impact on just sort of what we call Western esoteric practice,
Hmm.
whatever that means to you. I mean, even the even many practicing Wiccans today, um, who come out of the what's called the Gardnerian tradition, started in England, incorporate Crowley by virtue of that original teacher, Gardner, incorporating Crowley's work into his own path. So even for people who may not even consider themselves ceremonial magicians in the sense like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or Thelema, but are consider themselves Wiccans, some of those organizations are even in some ways probably feeling the impact of Crowley. So if you're going to signal the occult, whether you believe it or not, but if you just want to signal it because it sounds cool or because you want to make your album cover stand out, it only Crowley is the go-to. There's a million other people that you could name drop, but nobody knows who they are. And some of them may be even more important than him, like Agrippa, but who's going to mention Agrippa in their rock and roll song? So
Yeah.
the other thing about Crowley that's really important is that he himself lived like many rock and roll musicians in terms of sort of like a sex and drugs libertine kind of hedonistic thing, which was obviously a big part of, especially 1970s, you know, rock and roll life, right? I mean, there's no denying that, for good or bad. So he was also, one of the things that even Jimmy Page said early on was when he was sort of citing, when he would cite Page, he was less citing him as a magician and more about as this sort of free thinker, again, this sort of libertine type, as somebody who was just, you know, doing what thou wilt,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's even more, in some ways, even more attractive. You know, did Jimmy Page actually perform any Crowley rituals? I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know if he's ever, I don't believe he's ever said yes or no to that actual question. I don't think the Beatles ever did, and he's on their album cover, Sergeant Pepper. He
Mhm.
shows up as one, obviously, as one of those people in the broad crowd of that composition of that cover of that album. So, their spiritual life was much more Eastern, right, in terms of
Mhm.
that philosophy. But again, as a cultural figurehead, it made sense that he would be on that album, on the Sergeant Pepper album cover.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Ozzy's going to have to sing about him for all the reasons we've been we've been saying, right?
Yeah.
But then I think somebody like Page, and I think even somebody like David Bowie probably took him more seriously in terms of their reading of him and what it may have, what the things he wrote about in terms of his own magical practice, what that may have meant for them, both spiritually and as artists. So I think, certainly there are many for whom both he, yes, signaled something, but also I think was very important, just like he is and was, you know, to a huge part of what we call, the Western magical tradition right now.
Yeah, the Beatles instance is pretty interesting. Do you think that they might have been practicing that through maybe their music? Because one song specifically comes to mind. Everybody's like, it's an awesome song. I love that song is Yellow Submarine. And in a way, they just say the one line the entire time, basically this hypnosis trick. If you repeat something long enough, I don't know,
Oh yeah.
like people
What's
kind
the
of,
line?
we all live in a yellow submarine. They're saying the same thing over and over.
Yes.
And
Oh,
when
I
I
see
was a
what you
kid,
mean. Yes.
I thought the same thing. I thought it was an awesome song and was totally into it. But yeah, do you think
Yeah.
they could have been practicing something like this type of magic or hypnosis through their music?
Um, so I think there's two things to say there. I think there may have been an understanding that the repetitive, that repeating something can potentially create a trance state for your listener. Whether or not they were intending that as a magical practice, I don't know.
Hmm.
What I will say though is I don't think that they were doing it, even if they were doing it deliberately I mean, I just don't, my understanding of the Beatles, especially Lennon and Harrison, is that again, they were much more oriented towards Eastern philosophy
Hmm.
than anything like a Western magical thing via Crowley or anybody, especially Harrison. But if again, if it was deliberate in intention to kind of create a trance state, I don't think it was for any nefarious or sinister purposes.
Yeah.
I think it was experimental technique to see, just like Revolution 9 was, which Revolution 9 is considered by some to be the first pop rock band's attempt at something at what we call musique concrète, which is a term about a musical a collage of sounds using tape loops and backwards looping and does that have an effect on people? It absolutely does, but I don't know if that I don't necessarily believe it arose out of a magical intention, if that makes sense. But then you have a musician like Arthur Brown, who did that song Fire, famous song Fire, listeners may know,
Hmm.
who in many interviews talks very openly about believing and that his music was shamanistic, that he was trying to change his audience's consciousness
Hmm.
in a magical way, you know?
Yeah.
I think Coil is the band like that. I think Bowie, in some ways, understood that. He understood that so much that he started to invoke fascist ideas in
Hmm.
some interviews and in some conversations he had, which he later became really, this was like the peak of his cocaine years. And he later became really ashamed of but he understood that power. He understood, he believed that rock and roll could be used, music could be used in the same way, rock and roll could be used in the same way that historically in historical fascism had been used to control crowds, to get people worked up, to get people believing, to induce exactly what you're saying, these sort of trance states.
Hmm.
So he understood the power, and I do believe he may have called it a form of magic,
Yeah.
And so I think he was also somebody who was sort of deliberately playing with that. But I also think that he later saw that was dangerous, and even to evoke, Nazism or anything like that was in bad taste. I mean, he would say later. And even his own spiritual life became much more Buddhist oriented in the last part of his life. But the thing is, there is he stayed on this sort of non-traditional. I mean, Buddhism is very traditional, but you know
Hmm.
what I mean. From a Western point of view, it still is veering outside the sort of Judeo-Christian norm. I even think somebody like Madonna understood the power of sign and symbol to kind of create these consciousness shaping things, especially with, I point out in the book, I don't know if you've seen videos or even watched it at the time of her Super Bowl
Yeah.
halftime show,
Hmm.
where she came out in this sort of full priestess mode, being pulled by slaves, like, on in her throne, and it's very evocative of a tarot card. It's very evocative of, just these sort of weird symbols she used. And I think she knew exactly what she was doing. In fact, the very next day, the internet was on fire with conspiracy theories about that she's part of the New World Order and she's Illuminati and, all of that. And I think
Hmm.
that's that's her point. Like
Yeah.
that was exactly what she wanted to. She was right in that these symbols are so powerful, whether you mean anything behind them or not, which is unfortunate because I don't think symbols should be used unless you mean it, in
Hmm.
a sense, personally. But I think she was able to show, the power of these things. So again, the simple answer to your question is I think many musicians, including the Beatles, understood the power of certain kinds of trance-inducing and consciousness shaping symbols and techniques. But I don't think, especially for the Beatles at least, that there was anything sinister or even intentionally necessarily occult in the way that we might use that word.
Have you come across any artists that might have been using sound frequency or certain sounds to kind of evoke the same thing?
Definitely a band like Sun. Do you know the drone metal band Sun?
I don't think so.
It's they spell it Sunn, and then there's a little circle with the closed parentheses.
Hmm.
Many of your listeners will probably know about them. And they play extremely loud, heavy, low frequency drones, which, I mean, people talk about being in live shows and just being completely hypnotized by that. And I think that's an intentional, and they play it up. They dress in black robes. The whole, the entire set is surrounded by smoke. So they also are sort of playing with those techniques to do that. I think maybe the British band Hawkwind, but even in the early days of things that were going on with the use of um, the sort of kaleidoscopic things that like the early Pink Floyd shows.
Yeah.
I think they were very interested in, but they also knew that most of the people there were on acid. So it was easy, right,
Yeah.
to do that. I mean, that's the other thing about rock and roll and the music inducing altered consciousness is it's kind of easy to change the consciousness of somebody who's already tripping. Right? I
Yeah.
mean, they're already perfectly ripe,
Yeah.
for that. Um, are there anybody else do you know of that uses frequencies like that too?
I was gonna ask about groups like the Grateful Dead possibly being connected with the government, CIA or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of theories about whether or not some of the counterculture was, was infiltrated by the CIA. There was a whole conspiracy theory about that the hippie movement itself was manipulated, and that LSD was something that was given to the counterculture both to be able to manipulate, but also to be able to discredit the anti-war movement. I mean,
Hmm.
again, I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't. My, one of the things I will say for Season of the Witch is except for some of the way in which the Christian right um, challenged or critiqued rock and roll, I avoided doing any. Um, I try my best to avoid doing any writing or investigation of rock and roll conspiracy theories. There's a lot of books out there that do that.
Yeah.
Um, but that was not a take that I just wanted to explore. I was again really focused on the cultural and the public imagination, and what is it about a symbol, just like a pentagram? What is it about that symbol that just
Hmm.
is so evocative? And you have a record producer, marketing PR guy that's like, hey man, we should just put an upside down pentagram on the album cover. And the band's like, okay, I guess, yeah, that's cool. And so, yeah, I tend to, personally, I don't believe there's any, you know, a government or other control over the rock and roll industry. Or I know there was a lot of stuff around, especially in the early 2000s, around the Illuminati and rock and roll and Kanye, and he would flash the triangle. Um, that's not anything personally that I give any credence to. I don't. Obviously the CIA, were involved in a lot of things having to do with culture. Um, but I don't, and I'm sure that there were some ways in which people were planted, into scenes
Hmm.
to cause trouble but I don't think personally, again, I don't think there was any um, use of either by the government or by any other sort of vast intelligence to use rock and roll to um, control or manipulate the public. That's just my own.
I respect that. I mean,
Yeah,
because your book does, it just lays out facts very cleanly, which I
yeah.
love about your writing. Speaking of the visual aspect of everything, were there some of these visual artists that you mentioned in the book that you can talk about a little bit that some of these bands and artists would go to for this symbolism?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really important, well, especially in the '60s, but the rock with the mute with the rock posters, the poster artists were very influenced by people like Alphonse Musha, which if you look at, you'll immediately recognize his. I mean, the prints are everywhere.
Hmm.
Audrey Beardsley is an important figure, one of the decadent artists. And again, all those artists at the turn of the century themselves were very interested in the occult, were very interested in, um, uh, unorthodox spiritual ideas, whether it was Rosicrucian or pagan, things related to pagan um, ideas, especially the Romantics. They're trying to return to sort of this pre-modern world where the fairies still, were with us and the gods still walked, and so you see that in a lot of that, and again in the pre-Raphaelite art, in the decadent movement, and in the symbolist artists. So many artists in the '60s, especially folks like, well, the artists who made the posters in particular, but also bands like Sid Barrett. It's Sid Barrett's version of Pink Floyd, the
Hmm.
sort of early. early days, where you can see that in the clothes they wear, very much look like, you would imagine this is how, it just is evocative of this turn of the century, almost like a dandy type poet artist, which was very much something that I think they were trying to evoke. The other, probably one of the most important artists, though, for I think both music and occult today in general, would be Austin Osman Spare. And Spare is important because he was the artist and magician who developed an idea of what's called sigil magic, which was adopted by chaos magicians in the 80s and 90s.
Hmm.
And for your listeners that don't know, I'm sure they do, but sigil magic is in this context where you would write an intention, say, I want a new job, and you would write it down and you would sort of slowly remove, I'm not sure the whole technique, but I think you remove vowels and then you're just left with the consonants. And then you sort of write the consonants on top of each other. And then from that, you sort of try to capture that in sort of a shape that resonates with you, and that's your sigil. And that sigil represents, as a symbol, a new job. That's the thing. And then the idea is you charge the sigil. And so there's different techniques for charging it. You can bleed on it. People use menstrual and fluid, semen, whatever they, to charge it. And then I believe some say that then you burn it. The band Psychic TV, incredibly important. They started an organization called Topi, Topy, and they became known for basically collecting. People would do these sigils, and then they would send them to them. But Genesis Peorage, who was the head of that band and that organization, was really one of the most important people in bringing Spare back into sort of public consciousness, where obviously he wasn't as popular as Crowley, but he was an incredible artist in his own right and very much part of that decadent art movement. And so some of his work, I think, also was something that, for those that were aware of him, would have had a big impact. For those, look, there's 90, of, in the whole history of rock. I mean, one of the things about Season of the Witches, I wasn't trying to in any ways retell the story of rock and roll. I was only trying to show how there was this thread running through it.
Hmm.
But for every band that I mentioned that had even some, you know, touchstone of evocative of the occult, there were 100 that didn't at all. you
Yeah.
know, so Creedence Clearwater Revival is not in any way related to this business. Now, did they read in this stuff? Maybe, sure, why not? So again, I don't, there's a whole range uh, of bands that are probably as important. But I do think that when you look at somebody like Led Zeppelin, when you look at somebody like David Bowie, there was a they they did something that was so special and unique. And I do believe that magic, in whatever form you believe it, had something to do with it. If only their deep belief in the potential for art to be its own magic spell really did change the world.
Hmm.
But again, I don't know if it's magical ritual or if it's, again, just their understanding of art influenced and inspired by people like Crowley and other occult thinkers and practices, their understanding that art itself was the most potent magic, maybe more potent than drawing your magic circle and trying to conjure a demon.
Hmm.
And that's also something I believe too, that that real psychic consciousness change happens with with the art, which sometimes, yes, is an expression of some occult idea.
Were there any album covers that you came across or that you know of that you didn't, you were like surprised to find symbolism in, where like just to the naked eye
Um,
you wouldn't notice, but then like somebody breaks it down and you're like, holy shit, there's some kind
that's a
of,
good. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure there are many.
was
Um,
most of it pretty obvious, I
I
guess.
mean, just the stuff that I was looking at again. I mean, even like, Led Zeppelin, like what are you gonna see? The Houses of the Holy album version with the kids crawling up the stones with the guy at the top. I mean, that's all, and with the gatefold. I mean, again, it's all very evocative of
Yeah.
something, but what? I don't know that that adheres to any historical symbolism.
Yeah.
Um, so of course, there was the whole thing with looking for clues on the Beatles albums about, Paul McCartney's death or, supposed death. Then those are the other things that my brother would scare me with, was showing me all those clues, Um,
Was he a McCartney died person?
he didn't think so, but he used to like to scare me with you know,
Yeah.
so he would be like, ooh, you never know. Um, so yeah, I think, I mean, I think there are bands that are still doing that today that are playing, with those ideas, and I'm sure that you could see them on their album art, although the album as a object, is not quite as potent as it used to be.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of bands are putting it on vinyl, obviously, but it's just not, it doesn't have that same,
Yeah.
there was just something so special about,
Like,
especially when you're stealing them from your older sibling's room,
yeah, the physical copy, man, it's something that's really gone away and it's very disappointing. I wonder if, because people say like the blue light technology, I wonder if like that kind of symbolism coming through that artwork in that way has any effect or if it changes the effect.
What is that? What does say that more about
I
that?
I guess like when you're looking through or you're looking at your phone and you see the
Oh, I
artwork like
see.
on
Yes.
Spotify, like through that blue light
Yes.
technology, whatever, if you're receiving it in a different way and if that has any effect on the way
Yeah.
that you receive it.
I think if anyways, you're not getting it quite as miraculously as holding that amazing
Yeah.
thing in your hand and
Hmm.
you know.
Seeing it in the grandma's attic and you're like, what the fuck is that?
Exactly. Exactly. Now you're a musician yourself, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have this podcast.
Hmm.
Do you find that those for your own life as an artist, those things come together in any way?
Just more of my beliefs and who I am as an artist come through my lyrics more than anything. I'm just more of like a folk singer-songwriter.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, when I started, I didn't tell any of my friends, and I kind of just let it go and trying to gain organic listeners through the actual topics and people that I have on.
sure,
I don't
sure.
need any outside hate from that kind
Yeah,
of stuff because a lot of people, they're not even aware of this world and this side of everything.
yeah, and then they just assume it has something to do with something demonic or satanic, and
Well,
that's
exactly.
unfortunate, so
Yeah.
that's not,
Yeah, I have some family that even, just from the name occult folk, they think that's demonic, just from the name,
right.
and they
Sure.
they they don't even know what it means. But you mentioned Jay-Z. Is he one of the main newer, or I guess he's not exactly new, but artists using some of this symbolism? And are there any like newer artists
I
that
mean,
you?
no, not he's. I mean, I don't even know if he does anymore. I mean, it depends on what you. Well, I mean, the problem is there's the mainstream, and then there's an incredible world of lesser known and underground artists and musicians that are
True.
replete with this stuff. I mean,
Hmm.
there are those that take it extremely seriously, and those that it's hard to tell, how much is also just for fun. There's an incredible heavy metal band called Blood Ceremony. which plays off a lot of these ideas. But they also, are just, they also could be just like another 70s, band of that type that sort of uses some of that imagery, right? Um, there is, let me think if I can think about some of the later bands that, yeah, there's a band called Person, P-U-R-S-O-N. They're really great. And then there's just all the really fun bands like Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats, and a band called Wand. And I mean, it's just there's so many bands that are doing a lot of what they were doing in the 70s in terms of playing with some of this stuff. But then you
Yeah.
have some actual pagan musicians, that are really in many ways are sort of performing what they would call rites on stage.
Hmm.
There's so yes, it's there's a broad range of that. I think we're seeing at least in the underground right now, underground music. I mean underground again. I don't even know what that word quite means the same thing anymore, but at least in terms of non-mainstream artists,
Hmm.
there's a lot of that. I don't keep up with a lot of contemporary music, like top 40 music, so I don't really know who those artists are, but I haven't
Yeah, true.
heard of anything where people are like flashing, Illuminati sign. It just doesn't seem to be the thing anymore.
Yeah, I think the
Uh,
go-to for people to try to say that about it, I guess, is Taylor Swift at a large scale. Have you noticed that, or do you think that's just bullshit?
I mean, again, I don't that she herself is some kind of practitioner, or
Or I guess maybe just using imagery during
I mean,
performances, shit
again,
like
she
that.
might,
Yeah,
but to what end? I mean,
yeah,
again, maybe in the same way Madonna does, but
hmm,
what does it end up doing except maybe selling her more records? She's not
yeah.
controlling the world. I mean, we have worse people that are doing that right now, so I don't know.
Yeah,
So there's always that question too when people say like, "Well, Jay-Z's part of the Illuminati," and you say, "Well, okay, but what has he done with that? Like, what's happened? What's
yeah.
what's the result of that? Is
I need the
it?"
documentary.
Yeah, exactly. I also think these things, they're fun to think about, but I also think that they often distract us from where real power is and where
Hmm.
really the demonic, if you want to use that term, is actually happening.
Yeah,
And I think it's more out in the open, and for whatever reason, too many people aren't wanting to call it what it is. So we distract ourselves with these other things. And I think my feeling about looking at the occult and rock and roll, listening to this music is it's just a blast.
hmm,
There's nothing I'm scared of. There's nothing I'm worried about for myself. I don't believe I'm being manipulated. I don't think people are ever again, that's not to say that, again, certain musicians weren't trying to see if they could get people zonked out, with a certain, loud frequency.
yeah,
But again, it's not like they were controlling them like zombies to go and kill people, right? It was just
yeah.
experiments in sound, experiments in what you could do. So, yeah, but I think, again, there's so many fantastic bands right now too that I think are still sort of playing with some of these ideas that just are a lot of fun.
Yeah, when people throw stuff like that around, I always just think, yeah, okay, but was the music not badass like Led Zeppelin? I mean, shit,
Right,
you can't
exactly.
deny that, you know? Like some of these
Exactly.
albums, some of these guys were fucking incredible,
Exactly.
you know?
Oh,
And
it's amazing.
yeah, there might
Yeah.
have been like an aspect of it, but holy hell, some of them just will never be replaced and or replicated or anything like
Yeah,
that.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, and there's even, even in the folk tradition, there's always been, an incredible connection to these things, especially with music, with folk music that is a little bit more connected to earlier traditions, right? That predate the sort of the Christ or even Christian thing, even those parts of Christianity that have sort of amulets or superstition, sort of those practices that might see that we might call occult, but actually, are something else. I
Hmm.
just was listening to an incredible, this is probably going really far off, what you originally wanted to talk about, but
It's okay.
there is a album here that I became aware of. Oh, it's called Folk Songs of Another America, Field Recordings from the Upper Midwest. And a couple of these things are actually people, some of the recordings are people describing magical charms and things that like their grandmother used to do, like if they had an aching tooth, like,
Holy
I
shit.
mean, that stuff was called witchcraft, right?
Yeah.
But for these people, it was just traditional things that was been handed down,
When did that
you
come
know.
out?
That album,
That is fascinating.
yeah, it's called came out in 2020, but so all the pieces are from 1937 to 1946.
So was that with the Library of Congress?
It might be one of those. Yeah, there's this thing. The Library of Congress Folkways stuff is remarkable. And, if
Yeah.
you really dig through that, you're going to see, again, the problem is a lot of what we call occult and the magic now are just people's folk practices from other
Hmm.
countries and things, right? Nobody
Yeah.
nobody called it magic. It was just how you
Yeah.
practiced religion,
Hmm.
right? And so digging through the folkways stuff is a great place to find some real nuggets of, sort of folklore that we might, on the other side of it, say, "Oh my God, that's a magic spell," or "That's this or that." But again, for the people's indigenous lives, this is just their own religious life, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and honestly, yeah, if you look into the intent behind it, there's like nothing bad about that. And
No,
it
absolutely not.
in a way, it's
Yeah.
just how it's been defined by like Western Christianity in a way.
That's exactly right.
It's very,
100%.
very crazy because I mean, like you said, if it's just like a chant or something or like a line that you say to make the toothache go away, is that not very similar to a prayer? Hey God, can you take
Yes.
this toothache away?
Exactly.
Like
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
pretty similar.
Yes. And that's exactly what a lot of those original, what we call these sort of folk practices were. I mean, what's really interesting is the American slaves who were sort of forced Chris, converts to
Hmm.
Christianity. They used to practice in secret, and they still practiced Christianity. They still prayed to Jesus,
Hmm.
but they incorporated some of these um, uh, African sort of ritual techniques into their worship. And so there's this really interesting mix of what they knew before, which wasn't Christian, but felt to them deeply spiritual. But if you were then a Christian in the South looking at this, you would say it looks demonic.
Yeah.
But and then it was incorporated into their Christian life, and ultimately it really is why we have gospel. It's really why we have the Pentecostal church. It's really why we have Elvis, ultimately.
Damn, yeah.
You can really trace these African religious traditions, which look like magic or look like to those who are afraid of it as something that's satanic, is a deep part, especially of Southern religious life in many ways. And
Yeah.
of course, that would go on, to be, there's all this weird mixing, in New Orleans, for example, in Louisiana, of voodoo and of Christianity
Hmm.
and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. It's not a single simple thread that we can trace. It's all these different things that come together.
Yeah, I'm sure because that was like a hub of early blues and jazz.
Exactly.
And I'm sure some of those same, like the folk songs in the album that you're mentioning, I'm sure there's that same practice going through the music in some way. Some of those are chants, like thinking like Iko Iko, like something like that. A lot of later bands covered like The Dead and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
You should in some of your music you should secretly incorporate some of these charm things and you know.
Maybe, man, I'll definitely look into it if there's something to it. Maybe I'll say something about like a we all live in a blue, not submarine, but something. I don't
Yeah.
know.
The funny thing is they're a great band, but that's a terrible song.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna get shit on for saying that because I do love the Beatles, man. I grew up loving them, but yeah, it was just that was one song I nitpick, but
Yeah.
because everybody like loves that song, I'm
Yeah.
like,
I mean, I'm also not a fan of like Octopus Garden either, so
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's really funny when it comes to that. I just wrote this down early on when we started the interview. You said that you're big into the movies and the horror films and stuff like that. Have
yeah,
you
yeah.
have you seen the new Frankenstein on Netflix?
I did see it, yeah.
Yeah, some of that symbolism is in the way it's all directed. Well, I guess in the original book, there's a lot of that as well.
Well, he was. I mean, the funny thing is that she only mentions it very briefly. I just learned about this recently. I mean, I've read the book, but for some reason I missed it. But before he becomes a scientist, um, he's Henry in the well, I guess in no, he's Victor in I think in the new one.
Hmm.
Victor talks about reading alchemists and magicians like Agrippa.
Hmm.
And I think he says that he tries to conjure spirits. There's a passage in Frankenstein where he says he tries to conjure spirits. And so I think that that's an important part of the story, that
Yeah.
often gets left out.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I think the original book is called like Frankenstein or the New Prometheus.
Yeah, Modern Prometheus, yeah, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
the who stole fire from the gods. Yeah,
yeah. I was interested if you'd seen that because I thought Del Toro did a really good job with it.
he's
But
great. Yeah,
mhm.
the yeah, um, yeah, and there's been a lot of incredible quote occult films in the last 10 years or so, like Hereditary and Midsummer. There's of course the Nosferatu that just came out. Yeah, yeah, there's that's an easy subject, right? If you want to make a
Yeah.
horror movie, yeah.
Through all your research into all of these topics, what is your view on the occult, like ritualistic magic and your belief into that? Is it as powerful as it's put out to be?
I mean,
It's
I
something.
believe in, so let me say this. Crowley said, Crowley defined magic as the art and science of causing change to occur in the world with will. And then Dion Fortune, magician later, not too much later, changed it slightly and said magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in consciousness according to will. And
Gotcha.
so I don't believe that magic can make my glass levitate, but I do believe that magic can create changes in consciousness, which I guess sometimes if you are trying to activate something if you're trying to, like, if you want a new job, magic is not going to make the job appear, but it could change your consciousness in a way that makes you more open and receptive to something, right? That maybe
Mhm.
you might not otherwise see or understand for yourself. But more importantly, I believe that it is true that magic can cause change to occur in the world, but the only way that can happen is through art. That art is the tool by which change occurs in the world, and that's magic.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a change There's a the comic book artist, not comic book artist, the comic book writer who's no longer a comic book writer but now a novelist named Alan Moore, who's known for the Watchmen
Hmm.
comic book and those. He's a he's a magician. I mean, he says straight out he's an occult magician, and he talks in many interviews, in many discussions. I highly recommend listening to him on this subject. That he believes that art and magic are essentially the same thing. That's the real place where magic is happening, and that the magic that you perform is going to actually be its most potent in the art that you create that comes out of it. And at the same time, art itself is a form of magic because it is doing exactly what the formula says, which is causing change to occur in the world through will.
Damn. Yeah.
But I think art is the key. Art and consciousness. That's what I believe in. I
I felt.
believe in gods or demons or I don't. That's a different question altogether.
Yeah.
But in terms of magic and the occult, I believe that in the context of art and consciousness,
Yeah.
that's what I would go for.
Has that
Yeah.
changed your view throughout life on what this reality is and what death is at all?
Um, well, I would say only insofar as that the reason why I believe it's less that it's less for me about the question of magic. It's more about the question of consciousness,
Hmm.
which I believe. I mean, this is a huge topic to open up with, but there's a question of does consciousness just exist in the brain as like a chemical uh, thing, or is it something else? And I believe it's something else. I don't believe that it's reducible
Hmm.
to brain activity. I think it transcends that. I can't tell you why or how. Obviously, most philosophers and physicists have been able to answer that question, although some take very, very strict, hard lines on either side. But I believe, yeah, and so I think that, yeah, so that's what I would say. I would just say that for me, what I've learned, what I've most come to understand is less about magic and more about consciousness.
What do you think happens after death?
I believe, I mean, I don't know if I believe in heaven necessarily,
Yeah.
but I don't believe in the total annihilation of consciousness. Like, but I don't think it would be, we'll even know that that's what's happening necessarily
Yeah.
because everything we know now is filtered through our ego, so it's impossible. Once you take that away, I don't know if we would even recognize it anymore.
Well,
What
man,
about you?
I don't think we die. Like, while I don't think our like soul, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
I guess just based off of everything I read and look into and stuff, and I guess
yeah.
like the
But I assume you were
all this.
brought up in a very different tradition than all that.
Yeah, I was brought up in a Christian way, but that we stopped going to church when I was young, and then I
Okay,
started going with a buddy, and I started playing guitar in one, and but I started to see like a manipulation through it all, and there was
sure.
always something about it that. And it's not to shit on Christianity or anything,
No,
because
no, I
there are
get
like
it. Yeah,
there are some good people that I've
sure.
met, but overall,
Also, Christianity is a broad thing,
yeah,
also. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
100%,
mean,
yeah, and
the
there's
churches here in Cambridge, Mass, are very different from the churches in Texas. I'll tell you
yeah, yeah,
that.
I mean, honestly, the ones I'm thinking about, like, just because I'm
I don't
like when
think they
I
have the pride flags outside like ours do.
yeah, well, ours are, yeah, the ones I'm thinking about down the street, pretty much telling kids they're going to hell if you don't think exactly like them.
Sure.
Yeah, there's just a manipulation behind it where there's a scare tactic, believe our thing, or you're gonna face this very evil thing at the end of your life, and
Yeah, no, I don't believe any of that.
yeah, yeah, neither
It
do
just
I.
doesn't
Like,
make sense. It
yeah,
just doesn't even make logical sense to me in
yeah.
terms of, yeah.
exactly. And that, that's why I've kind of kept this on its own, separated from the music. So,
Yeah. I don't know, man. You're gonna have to come out of the closet one of these days.
yeah, I have to a few of my friends around here that are also musicians, but I've kept it, pretty tight, close to the chest. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is fascinating seeing like the differences in views, and then in looking into all of this, you do see there are like rituals through the church that they even use, like drinking the blood of
Absolutely.
Jesus, eating the body.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's,
Yeah.
it makes you start to think that these things that we're
Definitely.
doing like every week, you're like, holy
Yes.
shit, that's something that they would say is satanic if under any
In
other
another
context.
context, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's right.
fucking,
Yeah.
yeah, it's fucking wild. But
Yeah.
yeah, well, I appreciate your time, man.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Yeah.
so
Thanks
much for
so
your time.
much. Yeah, it was really great to talk to you.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Excellent.